Hello everyone, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be doing a book review. I haven't done any of these in a while. Most of the stuff on my channel lately has just been Let's Play content, but it's something I used to enjoy doing every once in a while, was sort of taking a look at different books that I had read and talking about them a little bit. I've read some really good books lately, like Kaigan, which is an absolute masterpiece. A little over a year ago, I read Dreadnought, but I've read a new book lately, and I wanted to talk about it. I think that's what I'll do here in this video. Before we jump into the review, the gameplay, I'm going to show a couple of screenshots or excerpts from the book, but generally speaking, the footage you're going to see in front of you today is from the video game Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, which I thought would be fitting given we're talking about warships in this video. So I figured I'd show some footage from Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. It's a game that's currently in early access, developed by Game Labs, and it looks at the sort of the high watermark for naval gunfire type ships from the 1890s into World War I, and I think a little bit beyond. The ship designs definitely look a lot like World War II in some cases. So really from like the late 1900s to the middle of the 1930s really is what the game is focusing on. It is in early access. It's not on Steam yet. It's only available directly through the developer's website. If you're interested, I'll put a link in the description. You just have to expand that out a little bit so you can see it. Let's go ahead and jump in. The book I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit of a, I would say it's kind of a strange book. In parts of it, it's interesting. In parts of it, I think there's a missed opportunity. And then there's other parts of this book where the author, I feel like, I don't know why they included some of the information they did. The book that we're going to be talking about today is called Treaty Cruisers, the First International Warship Building Competition. The book is about the treaty cruisers that were built as a result of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1921. Well, technically it was 1922. It was negotiated throughout 1921, and then the treaty was signed and implemented in February of 1922, as well as various other treaties that took place through the rest of the 20s and into the early 30s. It is a book that really focuses in on the 8-inch gunned heavy cruisers that were built after sort of the moratorium was established by the Washington Naval Treaty around battleship building. The Washington Naval Treaty, for those of you who are unaware, came out in the 1920s. It was aimed to help reduce global warship construction, to help countries deal with budget shortfalls, and to also try and limit the likelihood of another arms building competition between the United States, Britain, and Japan, understanding that the arms buildup before World War I contributed, at least in part, to that conflict occurring. But also understanding that governments after the First World War were heavily strapped for cash and really couldn't afford the massive building that was occurring in the early 20s. Things like the Lexington-class battle cruisers, which were subsequently converted to carriers after the Naval Treaty here, and various other treaties and classes that were being worked on after the end of the First World War. We often think of the First World War as this war to end all wars, and yet, immediately after the war, building continued. They didn't immediately slash spending until the 20s, really, when these treaties started coming out. And it was really the first international arms treaty that prohibited building of certain types of ships at certain tonnages and all those things. And that's really what this book looks at. It looks at the 8-inch gun heavy cruisers that played a central role in the Second World War, but those weren't ships that were built out of a natural progression of designs. Those ships were built in large part because the Washington Naval Treaty put restrictions around the ability to build battleships. So there were a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, there was a moratorium on building new battleships. And then the Washington Naval Treaty came in and built a limitation to the tonnage of sort of auxiliary or cruiser vessels at 10,000 tons and a maximum gun size of 8 inches. Now, I said earlier that this wasn't a natural progression of design. There perhaps is one exception to that, and that being the British Hawkins-class cruisers, which had 7.5-inch guns and were displacing just shy of 10,000 tons. That's really where the 10,000-ton limit came. The French were of the opinion that that limit was too low for a ship of the size that would be needed to carry 8-inch guns, with the likes of the armor that would have to be included to correspond. And the British were of the opinion that most of the lighter cruisers that were being built at the time in the Americans and the French were actually substantially smaller than 10,000 tons, but they didn't want to put a limit that would restrict their own ability to continue building their Hawkins-class cruisers, and so they basically put a limit at which would allow them to continue building the Hawkins without allowing other countries to build much larger cruisers that would then require a response, and in so doing generate another arms race. And so that's sort of where this came out of, and then you basically ended up seeing every single country, with a couple of exceptions, really taking that 10,000-ton limit and the 8-inch gun size limit as the default of what everything had to be. So you saw this really interesting competition rise up where countries didn't really stop building cruisers, they just or larger ships, they just started building a bunch of ships up to the limit, so you kind of had a mini controlled arms race. Some countries like Japan really didn't adhere to the tonnage limitation, except in the very vaguest of terms. Most of their ships were several thousand tons over the limit once they really started getting going, but that wasn't, the ability to strictly enforce these limitations in an era like the 1920s and 30s was pretty limited. The Allies suspected the Japanese, the future World War II allies, the Americans, the French, the British, suspected that these Japanese ships that they were getting some info on, and in some cases were seeing, were over the tonnage limit, but they had no real way to prove it. It wasn't blatant enough or large enough of a disparity to be able to prove again. And perhaps that's why the Japanese ships performed so well, generally speaking, in World War II. The British and the Americans and the French all adhered to the treaty pretty reliably. The Germans at one point would end up essentially agreeing to adhere to it, despite I don't think they were actually signatures of the 1922 treaty, although a later naval agreement between the British and Germans would see them adhere to it. Obviously, the exception being the pocket battleships which had 8-inch guns, 11-inch guns, and were over the 10,000-ton limit, I believe. But in any event, that's what this book is about. And the book sort of has two key components to it. There's a beginning chapter that's really just sort of an intro of the design of the cruiser. It talks about how the cruiser evolved historically into the armored cruiser, which was sort of like a heavy cruiser, but also sort of like a battleship of its time in the pre-Dreadnought era. The armored cruisers, in some cases, displacing as much as battleships, although they weren't typically armed as heavily. And then they developed into the battle cruiser. So the original cruiser concept went from being an armored cruiser to becoming a battle cruiser, while the battleships went from being sort of the pre-dreadnoughts to the dreadnoughts. And then as a result of this treaty, you see sort of a reversal in size and scale back to the 8-inch gun, 10,000-ton ship. Now, this book, as I said earlier, is a little bit confusing. First off, I don't think I mentioned the author. The author's name is Leo Marriot. According to his very brief bio on the U.S. Navy Institute, Leo Marriot has written numerous books on aviation, naval and military subjects. He's now retired after a 50-year career as an air traffic controller, but still maintains his pilot license, flying a syndicate-owned Cessna 172. So Leo Marriot is not a historian by trade. He was originally a air traffic controller. He has written a number of books, but this isn't an academic book. It's very much, I would imagine this is somewhat of a passion project. He's doing the research, but his profession is not that of a historian. He was originally an air traffic controller, as I already said, which is not necessarily a problem. I think one of the best books written about General Warren, one of the Civil War generals I'm looking into for another series I'm looking at, is written by a lawyer. So, that's not necessarily a detriment. I mean, I'm not a historian or a PhD. I've got an undergrad in history and a master's in business. So, who am I to critique someone's credentials? As I'm talking about their book and I'm reviewing their book, right? But I am calling it out as sort of the background of the author. A lot of times that's relevant to certain people. Now, my biggest frustration with this book, if I really get into talking about the book after over 8 minutes of talking here, is that it's highly uneven, and it feels weird that the author focuses on some of the things that he does and doesn't on others. As I said, the book starts off with a brief history of the cruiser. After that, it dives into the designs of the different cruisers for each country. And so it gives a little bit of information around, like, well, 10,000 tons, 8-inch guns, here's the armor, here's why countries were building what they were building, they were responding to other countries, but it doesn't really dive in at all to the doctrine of how these cruisers were going to be used. There's a couple of passing references to the fact that the British had a big overseas empire, and so they needed a lot of cruisers to be able to police that empire. So in theory, more smaller cruisers would have actually fit the British needs. And, eventually the treaties had limitations around how many of each ship or how much tonnage of each ship each country could build. And so that put a natural ceiling on to how many of these ships the British could build. And because they had this big overseas empire and their cruisers would primarily be needed to keep the sea lanes open, then that would be something that the British would probably want more moderate-sized cruisers so they could get the most out of their tonnage limits. Okay, so it gave a little bit of information there about how the British might theoretically use their cruisers and what they'd be for, but it doesn't really go into at all the doctrine around the Japanese heavy cruisers. It doesn't really go in at all to the doctrine about how the Italians plan to use their cruisers. If you piece the pieces together, the Italian cruisers, obviously were used as auxiliaries to the Italian battleships. So the Italians viewed their cruisers much more as another striking weapon, something that would supplement their battle line. The British, presumably, again, if you read between the lines, wouldn't do that at all. They would have their cruisers off making sure that, like, raiders and other ships like that, like auxiliary ships, merchant ships, with guns, aren't savaging their convoy routes. So the British would be using them more in far-flung sort of independent usage. The French, it doesn't really talk about at all how they would use their cruisers. It doesn't really mention the fact that the Americans, how they would use their cruisers, other than the fact that they'd operate largely in the Pacific, so they needed slightly longer range. It really kind of leaves a big black hole in doctrine. I found myself learning and understanding a lot more about the Japanese doctrine from reading a book called Kaigun than I learned anything in this book. Now, that to be fair, Kaigun is a book specifically about Japanese doctrine and ship design and the building of the Japanese Navy that would fight World War II. So that was the actual focus of the book. But it just seems strange to me that a book that's really honing in so specifically on one type of warship really didn't look at all, other than a couple of passing references to how the ships would be used. You would think if your focus is, hey, these ships were built, you would also say why. More than just saying, like, the treaty said so they built them, right? Which it doesn't do a great job of addressing that topic. Another area that I found the book highly uneven is around the actual designs of the ships. It seemed to me like the early designs did a better job of explaining sort of the rationale behind the ship design. So the County-class cruisers, which were some of the early British heavy cruiser designs, I think there were 13 of them, it does a good job of talking about some of the rationale behind the armor layout. It actually gives a really interesting chart and graph on some of those ships where it says, like, this is the total tonnage of the ship, the percentage of the armor was 25%, the percentage of the guns or armament was 30%, the percentage of machinery was X percent. Like, it does a really good job of giving you that information if you're curious to see, like, how was the layout of the ship constructed. And it makes it very clear that pretty much uniformly, perhaps with the exception of the Japanese because they were cheating, is pretty much uniformly these cruisers were all massively under-armored. They had plenty of guns of armament, but the actual armor on the ship to respond to enemy shell fire was woefully inadequate. In many ways, it's sort of a humorous mini battle cruiser is sort of the way, it's fitting, I think, if you think that the armored cruiser developed into the battle cruiser, and then the battle cruiser essentially perhaps the role of scouting for the fleet is one of the roles that a heavy cruiser would typically do in this era. It falls back down to the heavy cruiser now, and it has the same fatal flaws that the battle cruiser had. The only difference is the heavy cruisers typically, unless you were the Italians, which I think the results showed, unless you were the Italians, didn't didn't use those ships in line of battle. The Americans perhaps also in World War II, but that was less because they wanted to use them in line of battle and more because they had to after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese used them very aggressively, but their doctrine was very, very different and unique. I mean, one of the big hitting points wasn't just the 8-inch guns on their cruisers, it was the torpedoes, which really shows in the results. But I think one of my concerns is that there's some interesting tidbits in here for different cruisers, but it seems very focused on the early cruisers in each country's class or each country's history. For example, it provides a piece of information about the U.S. Pensacola class, where it says the forward magazine had, I don't know, 3 or 4 inches of armor, whatever it said, but the rear magazine, according to this book, the rear Pensacola U.S. heavy cruiser class magazine had no armor over it. No armor at all over the magazine on the rear of the ship. And that was because their belief is there would be no engagements that would occur abaft the beam. So in theory, no shells would ever hit it. Now I'm going to include a brief little graphic here that shows what abaft the beam means. I'll link to the website where I found it. But you can clearly see here, like, the idea that there would be no engagements that would be occurring essentially behind sort of the midpoint of the ship, and on differing angles behind the ship, assuming that there would be no engagements abaft this portion of the ship seems silly. It almost assumes that the enemy would be on an angle of the ship. I guess what it really means is they're assuming the cruiser would never be fleeing, they'd never be running away, which and that the enemy wouldn't sort of have this angle on the rear part of the ship, so it would never be hit. I don't know where that thought process came from, but the problem is the book doesn't really dive into it. It just says there's no, the Americans didn't think the Pensacola would ever be engaged abaft the beam, and that was a dubious, assessment. But it doesn't say why they came up with that. It doesn't tell me anything about the doctrine that would lead to that sort of a assumption. It just makes the statement, throws it out there, and never references it again, which is problematic, I think. Again, if you're giving me a book that's about these cruisers and you're giving me a really interesting piece of information that no other ship ended up having no armor on their rear magazine, and you tell me that the assumption is there would be nothing abaft the beam, why don't you explain where that logic came from? Another piece of information which I think is really interesting is the book talks about how the Americans were the only country that was building heavy cruisers during and after the war. Everybody else stopped their heavy cruiser construction by the end of World War II. Really, sort of by the middle of World War II, countries shifted their focus. Even before the Second World War started, the British were clearly shifting more into, as we had alluded earlier, the lighter sort of heavy light cruisers with a lot of 6-inch guns, I believe it was. And like 7,000 tons. The British were shifting their focus into that, and they tried to negotiate for treaties that would loosen those types of regulations on those types of ships to focus on that. So the book mentions it, and it mentions that despite that and the American experience in World War II, the Americans kept building heavy cruisers, specifically the Baltimore class, even continuing to construct them after the war. But it doesn't say why the Americans viewed those ships as successful and that they wanted to continue building them, whereas every other nation decided not to. Now, part of it might be the fact that the Italians and the Germans were certainly not building heavy cruisers after World War II. Could be budgetary reasons that the British decided to switch, but it doesn't really talk about that. Obviously, the French were rebuilding their country, and the Navy was probably somewhat secondary to them after they had been occupied. So there's like pieces you could piece together if you know a little bit about the history, but I feel like the book should talk about that, or at least explain why the Americans viewed the 8-inch gun cruiser as successful. It does reference that the British viewed that 6-inch guns could put a similar amount of iron on an enemy ship because they could fire more rapidly and you could have more of them than 8-inch guns. But what about the armor? What about the doctrine? What else is it just rate of fire and steel on target, or did they have documented problems about the 8-inch guns firing too slowly? It doesn't really say that. And then why did the Americans continue building it? Why didn't they believe the same problem? So it throws in these little tidbits which are highly interesting, but it also doesn't really do a lot with that. So the book has sort of this intro, as I said. The real core of the book is where it's talking about ship design and the ships that were built. Again, the early ships seem to have more useful and interesting information. What it feels like is each country, it goes in and talks about the first cruiser that was built, and then it just mentions the subsequent ships and their specs. So it basically says, like, this cruiser had 8-inch guns or it had 8-inch guns with, 10, 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns with 2 inches of armor over this magazine and 2 inches of armor over the belt and 1 inch of deck armor. And then it would say, about the ship's construction during the war, the refits that it would have during the war. It would talk about, about that and how the ship changed over time. Sometimes referencing that the ship was sunk or that it wasn't sunk or whatnot. And then it would also talk about, then it would say, and then the subsequent class had this. But it felt like the subsequent classes had a lot less information about them. It felt like the subsequent classes were just kind of like, and then this was built. It didn't really dive into the details as well. I think it did a good job of setting up the first ship in the class. That's usually where you got a couple of tidbits around design philosophy, if there was any, and then the sort of logic behind some of the decisions that were made. But then the secondary ships just became a progression and list of more classes and more specs and more stats without really any analysis. And I think that is my biggest frustration with this book, is a seeming lack of analysis about the ships, and about the designs and about the doctrine, because I don't think you can truly understand why ship design decisions were made unless you understand the doctrine. And then that gets even more confusing, because as the book goes on, then the second half of the book is just a summary of all the actions that took place with the heavy cruisers. So it goes on to talk about World War II in each theater of war and a super high-level summary of the battles that occurred. I think the most interesting piece that I got out of that, there were sort of a couple of interesting pieces. One, it talked about how the British heavy cruisers, especially early in the war, were primarily on commerce duties where they were protecting British sea lanes, and it references a couple of engagements with British cruisers and German raiders or merchants throughout the world. And obviously it talks about the battles, like the battle with the Graf Spee, with the HMS Exeter, the Battle of the River Plate, and then some of the other battles like the Battle of the Bering Sea and other things like that where heavy cruisers were engaged. But it's all at like a 30,000 foot level. It basically says in like 1 to 2 paragraphs, here's what happened, but it doesn't really talk about like, all right, this is why this happened. A couple of examples, it mentions that, British ships lost electrical power in different engagements, which seems like a massive flaw, right? You're going into action and your ships are losing electrical power. Was there an analysis on why that happened? Was there a core design flaw that led to this to happen? Doesn't really reference it. A couple of times it does say like the Japanese had issues with their ships being, too top heavy and that they had stability problems. It just includes it as a throwaway line without really any explanation of why. Obviously, a book like Kaigon, specifically dealing with the Japanese design, philosophy, and doctrine, dives into that in more detail. But I would expect this to talk about that because it was a reoccurring problem with all Japanese ships, but especially with their cruisers. I would say in general, the summaries of the battles were good. I really enjoyed the Mediterranean portions of the Mediterranean chapters of the summaries of the battles with the heavy cruisers, because I don't know much about the Mediterranean theater, and to see how active the Italian fleet actually was in World War II, but then also how unwilling they were to press any attacks home or to really do anything with their with their advantages that they sometimes were able to glean. It almost seems like on a couple of occasions the Italians were in really bad situations because of British ultra intercepts that allowed the British to bring a superior force to bay. But also on other occasions, the Italians would completely, catch the British in a situation where the British, you would think, would be in serious trouble, and then the Italians would inexplicably pull back for various reasons and really not go for the throat, not go for the coup de grace, which is interesting. But because there was no explanation of Italian doctrine, how those ships were going to be used, what the expectation was of the of the Italian fleet, what the shortcomings of the Italian Navy were from a personnel and logistical perspective, why did they make these baffling decisions? There's nothing about that, really, other than to say, like, oh, they were worried about submarines, so they turned around. Like, okay. But why were they so worried about submarines? Why wasn't the Italian Navy, didn't it have a killer mentality to go for the throat? Nonetheless, the Mediterranean sections were particularly interesting because the Italian heavy cruisers were so actively involved. I will say, though, there were pieces in there that really took away from the credibility of some of these summaries. While the summaries were generally good, there was a comment I remember about the Pearl Harbor attack. So it references very briefly Pearl Harbor because it wasn't a huge deal for the heavy cruisers other than the fact that the battle line was wiped out or heavily damaged, and so the Americans had to rely more on their heavy cruisers as sort of the escorts for their carriers and the indispensable weapon that the heavy cruisers became because the battleships were gone. Also, because even when the battleships were back, the old battleships, until you got the fast battleships, the Iowas, the North Carolinas, or the South Dakotas, until you got those into service, you didn't have any other ships that were fast enough to keep up with the carriers and provide the escort duty, so that fell on the heavy cruisers in sort of the decisive points of the war. But one thing it does reference in the attack on Pearl Harbor is it says, and I'm quoting, "The fuel storage tanks were heavily hit." That's a quote. It says the fuel storage tanks were heavily hit at Pearl Harbor in the Pearl Harbor raid. Anybody who knows anything about the attack on Pearl Harbor knows that one of the crucial mistakes that the Japanese made is they didn't attack the Navy's fuel store there. If they had attacked the Navy's fuel store, it could have crippled the American fleet's ability to operate in the Pacific and may have forced them to pull the fleet back to San Diego to operate out of San Diego until those tanks could be repaired and substantial new amounts of fuel could be shipped west. And the fact that the author says that they were heavily hit just as a throwaway line without explaining something that is so well known and documented as to not be the case, if he has a different interpretation of that, fine. Provide your evidence and talk about it, but to just throw it away as a line when it's something that I think is very controversial and not true without any explanation is problematic. I'd say one of the other pieces of the summaries of battles that were interesting is it talks about the last time that there was a major surface engagement between two vessels using guns in World War II, an engagement between a Japanese cruiser and some British destroyers in 1945 was also pretty interesting. But for the most part, the summary portion of the book, I think, is fairly weak. There were portions in there that were interesting to me because I don't know anything, really very little about, again, the Mediterranean. But it also was one of those things that felt like the whole first half of the book was about these ships and about their design and about like their specs, really. It was really a book about the specs and the timeline. But then it talks about the battles at almost like a Wikipedia level. It's talking about the battles like Wikipedia level summary, which at that point I wonder, like, why did I get the book, right? Like, I could just read this on Wikipedia, which I know Wikipedia is not a reliable source, but I don't know, man. When the author's saying some of the things that he's saying that don't seem like they're accurate anyway, I don't know if I'm better off reading Wikipedia or reading this book. And so I think getting back to it, I've kind of summarized my problems with it, I guess. I think it's an okay book if you're really interested in learning, like, what were all the heavy cruisers and what were their specs. Then it's a handy little sort of almanac of what happened. And if you want a really brief summary of what cruiser actions occurred in the war, then it's got you there. But is it something that I would pay $10, $11, $12 for? I don't have a problem spending that amount of money on a book, but I just don't know what this book provides in terms of value that's unique. So yeah, those are my thoughts on this book. I think it's probably a little bit harsher than most of the reviews I would usually give. And I probably should have quoted more direct spots from the book, but it just seems like one of those books that it's not super quotable because so much of it is just so vague and summary-like. Again, there were some interesting pieces, some charts about armor breakdown and different things like that. There were some interesting pieces because of my own lack of knowledge and information around the Second World War and sort of cruiser actions that occurred there. It's a nice little compendium and summary of some stuff that occurred, but it's also a book that leaves me scratching my head and wondering, well, if you really wanted to focus on the design of the ships, you should have just had a whole section on the Doctrine, and then you could have provided some summaries of how the ships performed when you were talking about the individual classes without going through a whole list of every action that the heavy cruisers were in. You don't need that second part of the book where it talks about the entire Second World War and all the cruiser actions. You could have had a handful of examples when you were talking about the ships in the ship design section and talk about how, this battle occurred and that was an example of how this ship had this problem. Or that battle occurred, and it was an example of how maybe the British electrical systems on their ships were not ready by the time for wartime conditions. Or this ship had a critical problem with its armor scheme, and it resulted in this damage during this battle. I think if they had done that when they were talking about the ship design, then it would have completely negated the need for that whole second half of the book. And this isn't a super short book. It's not long, but it's 302 pages. You could easily have delved into the design and the doctrine in more detail and still had a little bit about the battles without including that whole second half of the book. I think just the layout and the things that the author decided to focus on, it almost seems like maybe the author just sort of saw, hey, this is a topic I want to talk about, and I'm going to talk about it in a super high-level sort of a way, but not in a way that really dives into any critical analysis. And I guess if you're going to have a book that is really almost trying to be like a subject matter expert type book on this specific type of ship, I would expect more than just a summary of them. And I think that's my key disappointment, is that really that's all it was. It's just a summary of ships that were built and their specs without sufficient context, without sufficient analysis, and just doesn't add a lot. So that's my thought. I did include a link to the book in the description of the video. If that's something you want to check out in more detail and sort of see for yourself, see if you think I'm off base, obviously you can check it out. If you do buy the book, I do get a small percentage. It's an affiliate link. But in all honesty, I don't think, I'm not sure that this book has a place for anyone other than a super casually interested in what were the heavy cruiser ships and some of what were their specs. I had hoped that this would be sort of a compendium that would be really interesting to read and play through a game like Rule the Waves 2, or read through and play a game like Ultimate Admiral and sort of test out my own designs and see, how they could either how similarly designed ships would perform, or maybe how I could do things differently with the weight, with the tonnage allotted to me. But at the end of the day, I just kind of ended up scratching my head and saying, okay, some interesting information, but did I really want to read that book? Was it really worth the time? I don't know. You be the judge. With that being said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. That's probably enough of me rambling. About 30 minutes of it. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts below. I do want to do more of these types of videos. I think I would like to do maybe even, honestly, I think my analysis of the book might be similar to my view of the book's own flaws. I don't know if I dove in enough detail and enough analysis at critical points of the book. Just sort of sharing my general impressions. I read it a couple of weeks ago. I meant to record this a while ago. I had a few notes that I was referencing during the reading, but yeah. That would be kind of ironic if my own problem with my analysis is that it was too superficial and too high level, and that was my critique of the book. But it would also be fitting to a certain degree. Anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. I'm going to go ahead and sign out here. As always, leave your thoughts. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying once again, thanks for watching. And until next time, I'm out.